Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sean Rafferty. I'm the research director with Pennsylvania Sea Grant. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for attending session 4 of the Pennsylvania Lake Erie Bluff webinar series. This is the fourth of 4 webinars that we're hosting as part of this series. So this is the last official webinar as part of this series. However, my colleagues and I are in the process of finishing some additional tools related to bluff recession. So we anticipate scheduling a couple additional webinars in the near future. So stay tuned on those. Again, the purpose of this series is to highlight recent research efforts conducted by both Penn State Behrend faculty and Pennsylvania Sea Grant staff related to bluff recession and coastal erosion along the Pennsylvania Lake Erie coast. And today I'm excited to have both Dr. Mike Rutter and Dr. Tony Foyle with Penn State Behrend joining us to discuss the results of a recently completed study, which was funded by Pennsylvania Sea Grant, where they modeled bluff change along the western Pennsylvania Lake Erie coast and also quantified sediment loss from the western area of the Pennsylvania Lake Erie coastline. And so each of these webinars is being recorded. The first 3 are available on the Pennsylvania Sea Grant website. So in the chat box, you should be able to see a link to our website that has those webinars recorded if you're interested in those. Also included in there is my contact information. If you are interested in continuing education credits and were able to attend 3 of the 4 webinars, please do send me an email and I'll send you a registration link for those continuing education credits. And the last link I have provided there is a complete project report for the topic today, which Mike and Tony will be discussing. So if you're interested in downloading the full report, you can access it at that link. And the last thing I'll mention is Mike Rutter is going to be with us briefly, then he has to scoot out to go teach a class. So if you do have any questions on the modeling, please feel free to email him. And if you have questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature as part of the Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer any questions at the end of the webinar. And so without further delay, I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues and friends, Dr. Tony Foyle, Dr. Mike Rutter. Mike and Tony, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Sean. So thank you all for attending today. I'm Dr. Foyle, Tony Foyle, and then Mike will follow in a couple of slides. And where we're going to go today is the Northwest Pennsylvania coast, and we're going to focus on coastal change on this westernmost part of the county. So those of you who aren't local, we're technically looking at changes in a littoral cell. So technically it's the Western Erie County littoral cell we'll be looking at. And essentially change between the Ohio state line and the Presque Isle, which is one of our most important state parks for the state. So Pennsylvania coast has actually got 3 littoral cells. We've got one here in the West County. Presque Isle is essentially its own littoral cell. And then we've got a 3rd one in the East County. And then a littoral cell, for those of you who might not be very familiar, is basically an imaginary box that geologists and engineers working on coastlines use to account for sediment inputs and outputs. So a typical littoral cell will have, for us, we'll have an updrift end that's on the Ohio border. It brings sand along the near shore. You can tell from the coloration here, we're seeing sediment moving along the coast. Brings sand in from the updrift end, and usually some component of that sand will make it out the downdrift end, and that's important from our perspective because that supplies sand to Presque Isle State Park, which has got a long-term historical beach nourishment and hard stabilization process to combat erosion. The cell also, no matter where we are here on the Pacific coast, we may see gains or losses of sediment offshore across this long outer edge here. And we also see gains or losses across this inner edge. So if we're on an ocean coast, it might be losses to sand dunes. But for us here today, we'll be looking at gains from bluff erosion. So we're going to run down through a couple of sections today. We'll look at some Bayesian, which is statistical modeling of what causes bluff retreat on the Erie County coast. And then we'll move on to look at sort of the bigger picture and how much sediment this coastline or the littoral zone actually gets from bluff retreat, looking at some new numbers, using new types of data to collect that information. And this project was funded by Pennsylvania Sea Grant over the last 2 years or so. So if you want more reading on this, anytime at your leisure, Sean just mentioned this, there's a longer report on the left that's available from the PA Walter psu.edu website. And then if you want a shorter version, it's the project report that went to Sea Grant, and that's on the Sea Grant website. So if you're interested in further stuff, especially on the statistics, it's all in those two reports, especially the one on the left, because that's the bigger one that's got more information. Okay, so our study site then is the Western Erie County Littoral Cell. I'll just keep referring it to as the WECLC for the rest of the talk, less wordy. We're looking at Bayesian modeling at 7 specific sites. These guys here, site 1 up to site 7, where we're using statistics to try and explain bluff retreat on this coastline. So we'll be talking about that. And then in the second half of the talk, we'll be looking at how much sediment is actually coming into the nearshore or to the littoral zone on this coastline from these 6 major, they're technically Huck 12 watersheds on our Western Erie County coast, how much sediment they bring in. And this number we'll come back to a couple of times, because this is the number we're seeing, and it's important because it's a very small number compared to prior research. And that's got implications for property owners with beaches along the shoreline here, and then also Presque Isle, which is, it's more interest to the state, because if they're not getting as much sand from our littoral cell coming into theirs, maybe they need to think about more or less nourishment to keep the beaches more stable at that location. Okay, so the boundaries then for our littoral cell run from the updrift end right on the Ohio state line. There's a small headland here, and then extends down to a large groin just before we step offshore at Presque Isle State Park. If there's more sort of technically oriented people here, technically this littoral cell does extend up to Conneaut Harbor, because usually we define these littoral cells based on major promontories or headlands on the coast. And Presque Isle is obviously one, Conneaut is the other. But the only reason we didn't go extend into Ohio because there was incomplete data coverage of the types of data we're using, specifically LiDAR. So we just extended as far as the Ohio border. Maybe something just to keep in mind as we go through the talk later is there's potentially maybe about 1,000 cubic meters a year of sand coming in from the 2 kilometers of bluffs here between the state line and Conneaut that are adding to this 13,300. It's a relatively small component. So this is even though it's not an entire littoral cell, it's pretty close approximation. So littoral sediment transport on our coastline is towards the northeast or in the downdrift direction, as the arrow shows. And it's that way because when we look at a long-term graph of wave energy approaching this coastline, it's essentially coming out of the west or the west-northwest. And that's what drives long-term sediment transport to the east or northeast. On our coast, also Ohio and New York also, sand is moving right across your screen. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Mike, who's going to be looking at the Bayesian modeling aspect for about the next 10 slides or so.
Yes, thank you, Tony. And again, I apologize that I have class scheduled in about 20 minutes. So I'm going to do the statistics and then skedaddle. And so again, if you have any questions, my email address is mar36@psu.edu. So please feel free to follow up. As has been suggested, our goal here is to model observed short-term bluff retreat rates. And so when the data was collected for this, and I will say up front that I am the statistician of the group, and the other authors on this paper are definitely the experts on looking at bluff erosion. And so the data that they supplied to me had a whole bunch of different variables in it, which I'll show many of them in a second. But we had measurements that were done over a short-term period, and we wanted to see if we could estimate what those rates were based upon all the other variables that we had in the system. And this is not a simple system. It's very complex. It's very nonlinear. And so the traditional method of like simple linear regression is not really applicable here. So we had to take a slightly different approach to how we looked at this. And so we recognize there's multiple factors that could impact short-term retreat rate, but we just don't know what the magnitude of the impact of each of those factors are. And so we had long-term retreat rate for how long of a period was that, Tony? Was that
38.
Back to 1938? Yep. And so that we had measurements that were over a long period of time. But we also had things like wave impact. It was measured in hours per year. We had resiliency, which is a measure of how resilient the the bluff was to erosion. We had the bluff height, the toe elevation, the top shale elevation, the beach prism width. So we had information about what the bluff looked like at the water level. We had the slope of the bluff face in degrees, and we had information about how much groundwater was flowing through the system at those particular locations. And so within each of those 7 sites that Tony talked about before, we had all of these things measured. Now, not every transect that we had information on had all of this information, so we used as much as we could here. Only sites and transects that had all of this information was used to try and figure out what the model was that could best model short-term retreat rates. Now, you could make an argument that if we know what the short-term retreat rate per year measured over the last 15 years is, why don't we just use that to predict what's going to be like in the next so many years? And that can lead to inaccurate predictions. It's a short-term retreat rate. It's been measured over a very small time period. And so if something happened locally that caused a lot of retreat, we don't want to actually model that into the future because that was just a one-time event. And so the goal here is to try to combine those short-term retreat rates with other information so we can actually get a more accurate representation of what the future might look like at each one of these sites. And so whether or not a site has high or low observed short-term retreat rate isn't necessarily guaranteed to exist into the future at the same rate. So we want to keep that in mind. Given the variables that we've measured, there's very similar or identical sites that have the same characteristics, and they might demonstrate different short-term retreat rates, which is a sign that this is variable. And so we want to try to get a grasp of what this variability is like so that we can use that to make better predictions into the future. And so that's the ultimate goal here is to predict, and in this case, I'll show you some 50-year predictions of what the retreat rate might be at these bluffs. Now, this is strictly for the sites that we have measured for this study. But there's a model, and in theory, that model could be used at other locations, but that's a topic for a different talk. So how does this Bayesian network model work? And so the way that we did this, and this is done in other study areas as well, is that we took the short-term retreat rates from 2007, 2015, those 8-year retreat rates, and we put them into 5 bins, okay? Those bins were selected, notice they're not equal width. They were selected more to make sure there was a relatively even distribution of the observations between those bins. So in this case, it'd be like the retreat was from 1.2 to 0.5 meters per year. The retreats are negative in this case, and the square bracket indicates that it was including negative 0.5 meters per year. And so we broke them up into these 5 bins. Now you'll notice there's a small bin that goes from negative 0.01 to 0, and essentially what that bin is, there was no retreat over that 2007 to 2015 time period. So we discretized, we broke the retreat rates into those bins. Okay? And let's say for an example site, we'll just call it A, the observed short-term retreat rate was found to be between 0.2 and 0.1 meters per year. Okay. Now, if that was the only variable, then we would say that's the rate it is for all years, and that might not be totally accurate. There are probably other, I should say back here. There are sites that might have had an observed long-term retreat rate of 0.2 to 0.1 meters per year. And maybe that's what site A has. And if that's the long-term retreat rate at site A, well, other sites that have that similar long-term retreat rate should provide additional information to what might really be going on, at site A, again, taking out the local variability. So we're looking at other sites that have the same long-term retreat rate and calling them similar to site A. And so if we can combine this information together, we can create what is called a Bayesian network model. Okay, so looking at those similar sites, trying to model what's going to happen at a particular site, that gives us our network model. Now, a very simple model would look something like this, okay? Now, there's not a lot of information about what the predictions are in this model. What this basically is saying is that the long-term retreat rate, I am able to predict what the retreat rate will be from 2007 to 2015. What you see here, those bars represent the frequency in which we have observations in each of those bins. And there are probability distributions in the background that relate this long-term retreat rate to the short-term retreat rate from 2007 to 2015. This is a very simple model in the fact that it only has one of the parameters that we looked at. but it would just create those probabilities for us. So for example, if site A had a long-term retreat rate of 0.2 to 0.1 meters per year, then we look at all the different sites that had that long-term retreat rate. We might see that the short-term retreat rate has a 60% chance of being in the 0.2 to 0.1 bin, but it might also have a 25% chance of being put into the 0.1 to 0.01 bin, and maybe a 15% chance of putting in a bin with a slightly larger retreat rate, based upon the observations that we've seen at the other sites. Okay? And so what the Bayesian network model does is it uses all of these variables to kind of calculate the probability of observing short-term retreat rates at that given site. So that's a simple model. Here's the model that we came up with after we did the model fitting process, which we'll talk about in a second. This is the overall model. Okay? Now, this uses 8 of the 9 variables that we looked at. There was one that was not included that didn't fit well, and that was the groundwater flux. And what we did is we forced all of the variables to influence the short-term retreat rate down here at the bottom, but we also allowed the model to find other relationships between variables. And so what this is showing from a data perspective is that the resiliency of the bluff face has, probability-wise, has an influence on things like wave impact, bluff height, and the beach prism width, which is strange because you wouldn't think that the resiliency would have anything to do with the amount of wave impact that occurs. But again, this is from a data-driven standpoint. Okay? And so this information in some ways are correlated with each other. And that information can be used mathematically to better predict what the short-term retreat rates are as you combine this information and you map it into short-term retreat rates. Okay? So again, these bar graphs here represent the percent of observations in each one of those bins. And again, there is a large amount of probability distributions that are linking these cells to each other. But this is why it's called a network model, because we've mapped a network of connections between things. And the Bayesian portion of it is speaks to how these probabilities are estimated. Why this model? Well, we picked this model after we looked at 511 different models. We used all combinations of all 9 variables from up to 1 variable at a time up to 9, and this was the one that fit the best. We used a technique called K-fold cross-validation to determine what the best model was. And what we do here is we take the entire data set and we break it up into 10 different groups. So we kind of subset it randomly. And what we do is we use 9 of those groups to estimate the model. And then we try to see how well that model that was estimated predicts the 10th one that we left out. And repeat that over and over again using different combinations to get a percentage of the time that the model is correct. And the one that does that the best is what we're going to call the best model here. Okay. And so that final model included all 8 inputs. Again, groundwater flux was not included. And so here's an example output that we get for one of the sites. And this is Transect 5 in that first site. And so it gives you a probability distribution. What is the probability that the short-term retreat rate is going to be in the different bins? And you can see here that basically it says that it's going to be between 0.5 and 0.2 meters per year at approximately 50% of the time, and between 0.1 and 0.01 the other 50% of the time. So this represents the variability in the data that we get from sites that are similar to Transect 5, results in these types of probabilities based upon that network grid that we saw in the previous slide. So what we can do is we can show a plot that demonstrates what the observed value was versus the predicted. Now, one thing you'll note is that technically this is a tie. There's a tie between 0.1 to 0.01 and 0.5 to 0.2. And so we decided to plot this where we'd show ties in favor of getting the observed qualities right. By the way, Transect 1 didn't have enough data to be included in the model, so this would be this transect here, and you'll notice that we have it modeled, we have it correct. If there's a black dot at the end of the gray bar, that would indicate that we have matched up the observed and the predicted correctly. And you can see there's really just one site that we're not able to do that in one transect in the first site. So the model's doing a pretty good job of fitting those observed short-term retreat rates. Now, what can we do with this? And I think this is the more exciting part of the process. We have these bins with probabilities in them, and so we can simulate future bluff retreat. And so we can literally take a random sample from these bins. Now, in this case, essentially flipping a coin. If it's heads, it's 0.5 to 0.2. If it's tails, it's 0.1 to 0.01. And we can do this over and over again by sampling from the distribution. And once a bin is selected, you can either take a retreat rate that's the midpoint of that particular bin, or in a more sophisticated approach, you could just randomly sample one of the observed retreat rates that were in that bin. And that's what we did. And if you repeat that for a number of years, you'll get a distribution of the possible retreat rates you might see at that site. And we do this, 100,000 times, and you get a nice probability distribution of what the retreat might be at that particular site. And that's what I have in this particular slide, where we have box plots that represent the range and some outliers of what that retreat rate is for the next 50 years simulated at those sites. And again, if you look at the fourth one over, because that would be site 5, you can see that that's kind of the distribution of what the retreat rate would be over that 50-year period. So it has a median of a little bit less than 10, probably around 8, but you can see it goes up. There was a case where it was about 13 meters, and there are a couple of cases where it was in the 6 or 7 meter range. But that, based on our model, would be a simulation of what the retreat rate would be at that particular transected site. And so we think the model is doing a pretty good job of matching the predicted short-term retreat rates to the observed values, just based upon the inputs we're putting into the model, which was ultimately our goal. And then finally, the average predicted probability of the observed values was 84.1%, which was pretty nice, and we were happy with that result. And we were able to take that model and predict future ranges of bluff retreat via simulation. Okay? Obviously, one of the things I would love to be able to do is go back in 10 years, 15 years, and see how well our predictions are. That's something we can look at in the future. And if we had more observations, we would be able to possibly put those bins for retreat rate into smaller values and then come up with a more accurate model. But given the current sample size, we feel that this is the resolution that we have for these particular things. Again, thank you for your time. I have to run to class. Again, if you have any questions, my email address is mar36@psu.edu. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thanks, Sean.
Great stuff. Okay, so we'll return back to the littoral zone and move on to the sort of second part of the talk, which is to look at the sediment supply or sediment export from bluffs into the littoral zone, which again is very important location in terms of coastal geology, because it's within this littoral zone, which you can think of as extending from like the beach area out to a longshore bar if we happen to have one. But it's the zone where most sediment is moving along a coastline. So it's sometimes called the near shore. So that's what this little arrow shows here. We've got sand moving. We're kind of looking towards the east here along the Pennsylvania coast towards beaches further down drift and ultimately towards Presque Isle, where all the sand ends up. And eventually it gets actually as far as Gull Point, where it either builds off a shallow platform off of Gull Point, or some of it ends up in the navigation channel. So we're going to be looking at, where is the sediment coming from, or how much sediment is coming into our littoral zone from bluffs. And we're going to be talking about a new high resolution mapping approach that's never been applied on the Pennsylvania coast before, and looking at some of the numbers we came up with. So we'll start off looking at prior research that's been done by researchers. Typically the Corps of Engineers did most of the work, and then Paul Knuth at Edinburgh University did some a couple of decades ago as well, up through the mid-2000s. So when we look at lake level, this plot goes from 2020 on the right back to 1930-ish on the left. So just taking part of the record. And as you locals know, or anybody in the Great Lakes Basin, lake level is always moving up and down. Every year the level's a little different than the year before. And those of you on Lake Erie know that last 2019 in June was our highest monthly average lake level on our lake in over a century. This is the dot right here on the right side of the plot. Our data that we collected we're actually using LiDAR. I'll explain that in a couple of minutes, but we looked at a time window or an observation window between 2007 and 2015. I just abbreviated some names up here. So this is Foyle, Rutter, and Schuckman. So this is our observation window, and you'll notice it lies within a bigger time zone of sort of average looking lake level. So what that means is the volume of sand we're seeing the bluff supplying here might be a number that applies to maybe a 15-year period. Over 15 years getting this much per year, rather than just a smaller time frame, just because conditions would have been very similar. The Corps of Engineers in 2016, there's a big report. It's available off the Corps of Engineers site. They looked at 3 different time windows going back in time to try and see how littoral transport has varied historically. So they looked at this time window, so 76 to 2006. And then right within that window, Paul Knuth at Edinburgh University looked at a smaller period of higher lake levels within that window, so 1982 to 1998. A little further back in time, the Corps looked at another window between 38 and 76, and then before that, they looked at an older window from 1879, and that's as old as the data gets. They were reliant on US lake survey sheets, which is a precursor organization to the Corps, and NOAA up through 1938. And if you're wondering why the windows are the way they are, it's just because that's where the data is available. We've either aerial photography or coastline surveys historically, or more recently, we've got LiDAR and high resolution aerial photography to work with. The Knuth number popped off here by accident, but that number, we'll look at some numbers here now, and you can see that over history, typically these observation windows have seen relatively high amounts of sand moving in the littoral system coming off our bluffs in Erie County. And so we're talking about 40 or 50 or 60,000 cubic meters per year of sandy material. Our number again is 13.3, so roughly 13,000 cubic meters per year. You would think anomalously small, but we'll look at why that might be the case. And the one obvious one from this graph is that our lake levels are low during our observation period. And if you think about it, if you live on a lake, you will, this rule of thumb I have on the bottom would come to mind. When we've got high lake levels, it means our beaches tend to go away, and we have a steeper bluff with more toe erosion. And then if the lake level falls, like the picture on the right, we'll have nice wide beaches, and it's much harder for waves to attack the toe of the bluff. So that's one reason why our numbers are potentially only about a third of the size of these larger historical numbers. And the Knuth number again is also about 60,000 cubic meters per year during the shorter time frame here, which had on average even higher lake levels compared to the longer Corps of Engineers window. Okay, so that's sort of the background on prior research and some of the littoral sand transport numbers that have come up in the past. And just keep in mind, one thing that's obviously critical here is what lake level was doing in those time windows. Was it high or low? Was it rising or falling is also important. So so next we'll just take a minor detour and look at our bluff geologies to fill you in with, if you're coming in from elsewhere in the Great Lakes Basin, you've got bluffs. They probably look similar to ours. Ours tend to have 5 layers in them. We've got Devonian shale bedrock at the bottom right down here. Sometimes we see it above lake level, like here in this left picture. It might extend 6 or 7 or 10, potentially as much as 21 feet above lake level. But most of the time in the West County, it's at or below or slightly above lake level. And then on top of that, we've 2 generations of glacial till. That stuff is about 2 million years old, maybe up to about 50,000 years old. And then on top of that, we have lacustrine sands. And these were sands laid down on the lake floor when the lake used to be higher than it is now. And then right on top of that, locally, in very isolated locations, we have pea gravels preserved. And they form during really relatively high stable states of the lake level. And these are kind of modern, these are an ancient analog of what Presque Isle is today. These would have been high stand, strand plane, recurved spit deposits. So we got 5 layers, and you'll notice here they've all got a different sand content. So we reviewed the literature, did some field work, got good numbers on how much sand these things contribute, these layers. So if you think about it, depending on where we are on the coast, if one area, if it's got a lot of the pea gravels, any amount of erosion there is probably going to dump in more sand and gravel to the littoral zone than an area that's dominated by glacial tills. So the stratigraphy then is important because it controls how much sand is going into the littoral zone. And the numbers vary, but they're always somewhere around 30%. Turkey Creek Bluffs are about 29%. That's our lowest. And then Elk Creek Bluffs, we see about 36% sand was the number we used for those. So our second and last geology slide, we're looking to the north here with Ohio state line on the left, Kelso Drive, Waldemer Park and Presque Isle just off the right edge here on the right side. We're looking northward. We're looking at the elevation of the bluff crest along our coastline, compiled from LiDAR data. And you can see it's quite variable. You know, obviously creeks, the bluffs aren't there. The western county's got lower elevation bluffs. And the center part of the county is is the one location in the western Erie County littoral cell where we have these high stand pea gravels preserved. So they're a good supply source for coarse gravelly material to the littoral zone. What else do we notice? The bedrock is at or above lake level pretty well in the eastern half of the cell. And then bedrock is at or below lake level in the western half of the cell. And that's important because that will influence wave attack. And if we've got more or less wave attack, that'll mean more or less sediment being chewed off the bluffs and going into the littoral zone. Stratigraphy doesn't change that much. It's all, you know, we've got the lower till here, which is relatively thin. We've got a thicker upper till section. We always have a cap in most places of the former lake bottom sands that are sitting up here. And then only locally do we have our high stand gravel deposits. And these other things, these are the sites we used in the Bayesian study that Mike was just talking about. He was giving you a lot of data from site 1 here, but what he was saying applied to all our 7 sites in total. So we've got good representation on both the Bayesian modeling, but in particular here on the sand loss to the system, to the littoral system from bluffs over time. And these are just our watersheds. So our higher bluffs, it's hard for you guys to read the numbers, but about 38 meters is the highest point. So lake levels here at about 174 meters. Our highest bluffs are up at 212. And then in the West County, they're only at 188, so they're about 18 meters high. So quite a bit of variation, just for context. So let's look at the recent research numbers again. We'll look at one example, the core numbers, for example, just because they're very available from the core 2016 report. So what they said was between 1976 and 2006, one of their time windows, they did their analysis and they said, you know, we're seeing about 38,000 cubic meters per year of sand coming into the littoral zone from bluff erosion along our coastline here. Okay, so an important number, just keep in mind as it relates to our much smaller number, which we get to later. The way they calculate this, it's different to ours. That's why I'm just pointing this out. They use a single crest retreat rate by every 1 kilometer along the coast. And the coast here is 35 kilometers. So they'd have 35, 1 kilometer stretches with an averaged retreat rate. They assume that the bluffs were made up of all till for this study. So there was no shale present, there was no sand present, there was no gravels present, or sorry, no lacustrine sands and no gravels. Everything was till. And when they did the numbers on that, they found out, the typical bluff then is made up of about 21% sand. And that's a little low. I mean, we're seeing higher numbers, which is interesting, but that's one of the assumptions they had. And then this leads into, they use an approach called the parallel retreat approach, where all you do is you look at the amount of retreat of the bluff crest. Let's say it retreats a meter in a year. And then you use that you would make some assumptions and assume what that means in terms of a volume lost from the bluff face right here. Okay, so we'll look at a diagram that explains that a little better, maybe. So these were assumptions in the core report. Some of them are common to Paul Knuth's work. So again, he's seeing high numbers, and either way, they're both 3 times higher than ours are, which is a conundrum. We were puzzled with it first, but then the more we thought about it, we figured out why that was happening. So the parallel retreat method works very well for inclined strata. So bluffs with a geology that looks like this, where we've got, this happens to be almost solid bedrock. This is the southwest coast of France. Just happened to be there one year and noticed this. It was kind of cool. We've got nicely sloping bluffs. And if we use the parallel retreat method, all we do is we could say that 1 meter of bluff crest retreat at the top of the bluff is going to be accompanied by about 1 meter of toe retreat. And then by default, we'd expect to see 1 meter of material lost from the entire bluff face because the stuff just slides down into the ocean. So if we want to calculate then how much sand is coming in from this source, we just say we take the crest retreat rate, maybe it's a meter per year, times the slope height of the bluff, times the length of the reach we're looking at. Maybe we're doing 1 kilometer blocks as the Corps of Engineers did. And then we multiply it by the percent sand, and that will give us a number. And that works very well for inclined strata like this. The caveat is, or maybe the catch is that for our coastline, our bluffs don't look like that. They're not sloping. We have a lot of horizontal layers, like we alluded to earlier. We've got the glacial tills here sitting on some bedrock, and we've got lacustrine sand sitting up here, maybe some of these pea gravels right on top. So we tend to have a more horizontal stratigraphy. So we'll look at this diagram for about 2 minutes, I think, because it's an important model for how bluffs retreat in the Great Lakes Basin, proposed by Zuzek et al. Back in 2003. And basically what they said was bluffs retreat cyclically. They kind of do a zigzag thing. So here we're looking at the bluff profile at time 1. And then at time 2, it's steepened up here, you can see that. And then time 3, it's jumped back a lot, and now the profile looks like this dashed line. And then time 4, it steepens up again because waves are chewing away at the toe, and we end up with steeper profile. And the bluff goes back in a sort of an oscillating zigzag pattern. Now, if we use the parallel retreat method on this, then it doesn't give us the greatest numbers, because let's say we look at time 1 to time 2. So this surface to this surface, and look at the amount of retreat up here. Not much, right? We're seeing very little retreat. We'd assume that the pink line you see now is how much material was lost from the bluff face. But if you look a little longer where time 1 and time 2 actually are, we actually lost this amount of material. So where I'm going with that is we can say then that when our bluffs look pretty stable, and we use a crest retreat, parallel retreat sort of method of calculating the volume changes, we will see an underestimate of sand export to the littoral zone. Okay. If we look at the next sort of time sequence going from time 2 to time 3, and I know that the screen is covering a bit, but we see the bluff crest has jumped back a lot. It's gone back here behind Sean sitting on a boat. We would think we're going to get a lot of material supplied to the littoral zone. Okay. But then if you look at these surfaces carefully again, you'll notice that's not true either, because now all we really lost was stuff from up here. Okay. And then the interesting part then is the stuff that got lost from up there actually ends up dumping down here onto the bluff face. A lot of it can stay on the bluff face. So what that means is during significant bluff retreat phases, we can overestimate the littoral sediment export to the littoral zone, because we're sort of predisposed to think that things might retreat in a parallel fashion. So that's another reason why our numbers are probably are different from the core work, because we're going to use a different method. We look at how we did it differently, and we would argue it's a much more precise way of doing it. So what we did was we used LiDAR data, which you can think of, if you haven't heard of it, it's just like radar. You're making a picture with radar waves, essentially. So it's not a visual, it's not a regular visible spectrum we'd see as humans. It's using a different frequency, but we can still map and see things just slightly differently. So that data is available for free from pasda.psu.edu. And that data was called the data we're working with just because it was good quality data and the time separation was good enough. We'd expect to see some changes on the bluff face. They were in 2007 and 2015. I can take this off, I just realized. That was funded, they were funded by DEP largely. So there's this available data paid for with taxpayer money that anybody can use as long as you've got the software and so on to play around with it, as it were. So we use that. This is just an aerial photo, an example of the stuff we did. So we were interested in finding out, on a per square meter basis, how much material fell off this bluff and ended up down in the lake in the littoral zone. And we defined our boundaries as this faint yellow line you can barely see, which is the 2015 bluff crest. And the toe of the bluff down here is no line, but it's basically where the beach joins the bluff. So everything in here, we're trying to figure out, was there a net gain? Was there a loss? How much of a loss, and so on. So just schematically, this patch here, we want to figure out how much material was lost from that patch. We'll ignore areas like when we see these ravines that are well developed on our coastline. We weren't interested in seeing what ravines were contributing, just the bluff face. But we do include these larger and more frequent, of all sizes actually, rotational slumps that are part and parcel of our bluff retreat process. So that's a photograph, and we can look at that with LiDAR, very similar picture, right? I mean, it's just a different wavelength we're using, same, but similar information. You can process LiDAR to take off buildings and so on if you weren't familiar with it. And now we see this is a topographic map. It's essentially a digital elevation model built from those LiDAR data points. And there's one roughly every square meter. So, you know, instead of like the core sort of averaging numbers along a kilometer of lakefront, we've got data every square meter, more or less, all across the bluff face. So that's the LiDAR. Looks pretty cool. You can see things happening on the bluff face, like here's big arc. That's some historical bluff failure that happened pre-1938, because it was there in our oldest records, our oldest photographs we can look at. And then some other stuff, you know, going, there's movement all across the bluff face most of the time. It's not just at the crest. So what do we do then? We just take a 2007 DEM. So again, that's a digital elevation model made from the LiDAR data. We superimpose it underneath, rather, the 2015 DEM, and then subtract the two. That's all we do. Yeah, it's all done in computer, of course. There's lots of, it's some serious number crunching, relatively. And what we'll do now is just zoom in and look at some example allocations to show you the kinds of changes we see on the bluff face. So we'll zoom in here with just a little bit east of Elk Creek, right? Elk Creek is right here. So we're a little east of that, almost heading into Lake Erie Community Park. So we end up with a map that looks like this. Okay, so this is the bluff face between the 2015 crest and the 2007 toe, and we've mapped all the change on this bluff face. And we've got colors, and we can express the change in terms of cubic feet lost or cubic meters, or maybe if you're more familiar with just using elevation changes, we can do that too. But ultimately, we want to get to the number of cubic feet, or in the metric version, the number of cubic meters. So we can see this. Most of the bluff face here is erosional. We're seeing a couple of green patches, some of this lighter yellow, which might not come across too well, but you know, most of the bluff is erosional. And that erosion occurs, you know, everywhere from the top of the bluff right here along the crest line to somewhere in mid bluff, and we see it down on the lower bluff. Things we exclude in our calculations is this bluff face right here, just because erosion happening here ends up on a plateau down here where there happens to be houses and roads, and that stuff's not going into the littoral zone. We also exclude strand plains or flood plains at, say, the mouth of Elk Creek, among others, because there's change happening here, but it's not a bluff contribution. And then the one thing I want to point out that here is, those of you who are from the area, you know that Elk Creek is a very good fishery. It's got a well-developed bay mouth bar running along its mouth. And that bay mouth bar is there most of the year. And it's very important for providing a sheltered habitat and a fish nursery. This bar is very dependent on littoral sediment transport, particularly from Crooked Creek watershed, because we'll see that one happens to be a very productive supplier of sediment. So here's another picture. This one's a little further east in Lake Erie Community Park. Same kind of thing. You know, we're seeing erosion all over the bluff face. This is definitely not parallel retreat. We're seeing it, you know, it hands towards the bluff crest here, mid bluff over here, down towards the toe over here, and so on. So obviously then, I'm hoping you're seeing our bluffs are not retreating like slabs sliding off a sloping bluff. It's very, very complex, and no matter, depending on where you stand. If you're at one location and you move 10 meters to your left, you'll have a different pattern. This is going west of Elk Creek into Erie Bluff State Park. And again, we see this is definitely not parallel bluff retreat. We're seeing erosion, and a lot of erosion near the top of the bluff here in this case. We're seeing some mid-bluff erosion. We're seeing erosion down towards the toe, which is probably the wave attack driving that. So we'll come back to this in a bit as we finish up today, but thing to realize about Crooked Creek watershed, it only occupies 18% of our lakefront in the WECLC. But it supplies just about a third of the sand. So arguably it's a very productive watershed for keeping sand in the littoral system that helps beach, property owners with beaches here and downdrift to the northeast, and also helps Presque Isle because it's a source of sand to Presque Isle. This stuff is going to Presque Isle onto its beaches and stopping it eroding as much as it does, or at least partly stopping some of that erosion. And our last sort of visual stop for now is the West County. This is out near Raccoon Creek. The locals might be familiar with that. It's a recreational area. Again, we're screening off the parts of the coastline that aren't bluffs, or here where the bluffs turn inland, and now they're protected from a large, pretty decent sized sand prism here, or strand plane. That material eroding from here is not getting into the littoral zone. It's staying down here on flat land. And here we see similar, these are lower bluffs, they're only 18 meters tall, but we're seeing, bluff crest erosion. That's going to make the the crest retreat quite a bit. Toe erosion down here that might just steepen the bluff. And then we see occasionally interesting things like this in the West County. Those who've been out there have probably noticed that the bluff in the West County near the state line tends to be stepped. It's like a two stairs. There's the contact between the glacial tills and the overlying lacustrine sands tends to erode fast. So what these green patches are is stuff falling off the high part of the bluff onto this bench just down below. So we'll pick it up over the 8-year period as local little patches of accretion, okay, just fortuitously. So that's the graphics table, a lot of numbers. I'm going to point out 4 numbers here that are important, okay? So these all come from, when we look at these kinds of maps all the way along the coastline for the 35 kilometers, we can get numbers out of GIS. So here we've got our 6 major watersheds, okay? And we're looking at the 8-year period, so from 2007 to 2015. And there's been a gain. So on the bluff face, some of the bluff patches, you know, like we just saw on this slide, we see greens. There's sediment being trapped, but you will notice the amount of loss is much larger. So on net, then we're seeing way more loss than we're seeing gain, and that's what we expect because we know bluffs, if they're not stable, they're retreating. They're never prograding out into a lake. So our 8-year net change then, when we sum them all up, is almost 1/3 of a million cubic meters over 8 years. That's of total sediment. Just want to be clear on that. I haven't mentioned that yet, but that's everything from clay to boulders to like house-sized boulders falling out of the glacial tills. About 70% of that is so fine-grained, it gets dragged offshore pretty quick and starts filling in the outer, you know, the Lake Erie way in deep water, all these clays and silts. It's very fine, muddy stuff. Look at another table in a second, just looking at the sand part of it. Annually, we're seeing a loss of about 40,000 cubic meters per year of sand. I'm going to highlight these guys. Okay. If we look at Crooked Creek, you will notice when we normalize the numbers, the first 2 numbers we just looked at, to the cubic meters of sediment lost per kilometer of bluff per year in that watershed, Crooked Creek is very productive, 2050. It's about twice what the average is for the entire coastline. And it's like at least once or twice to like 3 times as large as any other watershed on this column on the right here. So it's a very important source. And I keep mentioning Crooked Creek just because it's popped out as unique in that context. It's an important source for littoral sand on our coastline. So looking at the sand version, so now we're ignoring all the clays and muds and stuff and looking at the sand content. We got that from the stratigraphy because remember we know different layers have different sand contents. We can integrate that. And this is the stuff that pretty well stays in the littoral zone, 100% more or less. The core thinks there may be 10 to 20% escaping offshore, but for here was to assume this is sand and gravel and boulders. It stays in the littoral zone. It's heading down to make beaches to the northeast and make Presque Isle a little less short on sand. So here we see over the 8 years, a net loss also, no surprise there. Okay, and when we average that then per year over the 8 years, that's our 13,300 cubic meters per year of material coming off the western Erie County bluffs to supply the littoral zone. Okay, and that's the small number. Remember the core and Paul Knuth were seeing in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So our number is kind of small. Look at the normalized data again. We'll look at Crooked Creek again. You'll see that it cranks out 700 cubic meters per kilometer of bluff per year in that watershed. That's a big number. I mean, the average for the whole coast is about half that. And then every other watershed is half or less than that. So again, it's a critical sand supply system for our coastline. So to put all that into a graphic again, this is like a nice summary graphic. I think it's showing us that on our coastline, we've got about 13,300 cubic meters a year of sand and gravel and boulders moving along in the nearshore zone, you know, helping build beaches, helping Presque Isle stay partly sand nourished. And then each watershed, the bluffs along the lakefront of each watershed supply a certain amount, and it's very variable. Some watersheds supply hardly any. Obviously, Elk Creek is very low just because there's not much bluff here. Most of the lakefront is actually the floodplain. And our 2 most important watersheds are Trout Run and Crooked Creek, but when we normalize it to meters of bluff crest kilometers of bluff crest per watershed, because you see Trout Run is very long, Crooked Creek is about half the size. Crooked Creek pops out as being the most important contributor. So it's highlighted here, even though the number's a bit smaller than it is for Trout Run here. So we're arguing that the Bluffs and Crooked Creek and the Watershed and Erie Bluff State Park, which is right here in that watershed, export anywhere from 53 to 220% more sand to the WECLC than any other watershed. Sand plus here just means sand, boulders, cobbles, and so on. So it's, a very important resource, and fortuitously half of it is occupied by Erie Bluff State Park, where there's no efforts being made at shoreline stabilization or limiting development along the bluff crest because no one lives there. And that's a good thing because it is a very important watershed for our coastal system. And it's possibly, if the county is interested, there's been similar work to this done in Puget Sound, Washington, and a group of authors working for Washington State Department of Ecology, the equivalent of CZM and DEP a bit, Shipman et al. They proposed a feeder bluff conservation program they're adopting on Puget Sound. And their goal is to preserve lakefronts like here in Crooked Creek and allow them to continue eroding naturally to supply sand to the littoral system, because they know without that, if they put in seawall all on the bottom of this, or like we see over here in Mill Creek, where more of the bluff toe has got seawalls on it, you're depriving the coast of sediment. And usually that's not a good thing because it will induce erosion somewhere else downstream, whether it's here in Pennsylvania, Puget Sound, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and so on. So I'm going to finish up on our last slide, and we're going to run down through some of the major implications for the Pennsylvania coast of this study. So we came up with the Bayesian model, which explains bluff retreat using 8 inputs. Okay, ironically enough, we need to look at that some more in the future because, as Mike mentioned, groundwater did not appear to play a big role. It dropped out of the model. I think the reason for that is because it's very hard to quantify how much groundwater is coming out through the bluffs without a lot of field work. The most owner useful inputs in that model are probably the crest retreat rate and the bluff slope and the toe elevation and the beach volume. What I mean by that is if you're moving to our coastline or you're living here and deciding, is this erosion problem on my bluff crest too much of a pain? One way to sort of gauge it is if you're living on a bluff crest where there's been a pretty large retreat rate historically, so the long term, go back to 1938 at least, if your bluff slope is steep, those two would not be a good combination. Or if your toe elevation, so the base of your bluff is very close to lake level, maybe like at lake level rather than like 1 or 2 or 3 feet above lake level. And if you don't have much of a beach, that would also not be a great thing. So the model is, it's got this sort of regular everyday usage in that some of these inputs it assigned worth to are actually useful to property owners just to monitor. And even if you're considering buying a property, and before you do, you'd be able to get some of this retreat information from DEP, for example. You'd be able to get bluff slope information off some of the map products we're generating or from the USGS and so on. The model's pretty good at simulating possible future bluff retreat, and we'd argue it's more statistically meaningful than using what a lot of states still do. They'll just take an erosion rate based on past data, and maybe the window isn't that long. Maybe they're not using many years of annual erosion, the average annual erosion retreat rate, AORs. So this gives us a more statistically meaningful number, I think, than using that sort of traditional method, which is easier to collect, number one, because it's cheaper, there's less modeling and all that kind of stuff. We know from the sediment work that we have these 10 to 15-year periods of average lake level. They've occurred, in the past, if you think back to that lake level slide, and they will occur in the future when we see a 70% reduction in sand export from the bluffs to the littoral zone. And maybe, either individual property owners, more relevantly here is Presque Isle State Park, and their sand management might need to be aware of that and consider that there will be a decade-long period scattered, as time goes forward, when they're getting less sand coming in from updrift than they think they're getting. And that will probably help them adjust their nourishment numbers they think they should be putting on the beach on a year-to-year basis. Crooked Creek is the most important watershed. Okay, so it supplies about 30% of the sand to the WECLC, and it supplies as much as 220% more sand than other watersheds on our coastline. So related to that, then coastal managers could consider, since we have a state park there already, and if you think about Crooked Creek, it's not, those of you familiar with it, the watershed is one of the least engineered watershed shorelines we have. So it's an ideal candidate for a feeder bluff conservation approach that will keep it in its natural state, even though it's eroding, you know, it's still aesthetically very pleasing, and that will help our whole coastal system. And then lastly, you know, the numbers we have today, they're small, but there's also some uncertainty. I didn't talk about that too much, but like every method, we've got uncertainty. And what we learned was we could reduce that uncertainty by looking at a larger time comparison window. Okay, and what that means is maybe we don't need LiDAR data as frequently for our coastline as we might have thought a couple of years ago. You know, we need at least 10 years of data, arguably 15, to see enough change on a bluff crest if it's retreating, or on a bluff face if it's losing sediment. So that's important because LiDAR is always expensive to fly, and some places might get it way more frequently than they have a use for it. We sort of estimated from this study that a 10 to 15 year time period will be sufficient on our coastline for this kind of, you know, purpose. So there are major takeaways then for, you know, how all this relates to the Pennsylvania coast. And I'll take any questions you have. And again, we've got the reports available online that if you're interested in getting more technical stuff, it's all in there. Otherwise, I'll pass it back to Sean for a bit.
Thank you very much, Tony. Very informative. Appreciate it. So far, so we had one question as Mike was talking, but you may be able to address this one. The question was, in the modeling, how are areas with protective seawalls considered, or were they considered?
Okay, so let's see. Ooh, we had areas with seawalls. So I'm thinking of our site 6, which was, if the person is local, it was from Walnut Creek going eastward. There are seawalls. We didn't put those in there. Okay, so most of our sites, in fact, it's only site 6 that had seawalls within because our Bayesian sites were 1 to 2 kilometers long. That was the one that had the obvious seawalls, and the rest didn't. So maybe a future iteration, that's something to look at, how the seawall might affect those numbers. Exactly, that's a good question. And that's about as far as I could go in the answer. Might be able to answer more, but it would. In general, seawalls on a bluff coast will stabilize the toe, and in theory, that will have some positive effect on the crest line. It will stabilize the crest line in most cases, unless we've got a lot of groundwater trying to escape, and that will make the crest just continue to fail as normal, but seawalls will keep the waves at bay for a while.
Okay. That was the only question so far, Tony.
Okay.
Please do use the question and answer. We do have a couple minutes left. If there's no other questions, we'll end there. But I did have a general question, Tony, and you did touch upon it briefly, is so with the numbers you and Mike and Karen came up with, how do you think that impacts Presque Isle? And I know, you know, perhaps we thought more sand was going to Presque Isle than actually is. Yeah,
because the historical data, remember, it's all like 30 or 40 or 50. And I think the Corps and the park, they use, at the back of their minds, if they don't use this number specifically, they're working with an assumption that the coast west of Presque Isle is supplying about 30,000 cubic meters a year. Okay, so if they know they're getting 30, and they can figure out through modeling, the Corps does this, that they actually need 100,000 cubic meters of sand arriving at Presque Isle to keep the beaches as wide as they are. They know they got to nourish 70,000 cubic meters. But then for like these 10 to 15 year time periods, if they now know that during those periods there's only 13 or 14 or 15 coming in, if we add the 2 kilometers in Ohio, that would suggest to me that they would probably want to boost the nourishment volume over for that bunch of years. Instead of being 70, adding to 30 coming in from the coast, they might want to add 85 to account for that reduced amount coming in during that time period.
Thank you. And we did get one more question while you were answering that. I think this will be the last one we take. We're right up against the time here, but do please feel free to reach out to myself, Tony, or Mike with any questions you may have in the future. We did get a question here. Have you considered whether and how you might incorporate future water level changes and/or wave climate changes into the modeling?
Oh, yes, definitely. But as Yogi Berra said, the future is hard. The future is very hard to predict. So the model even Mike was working on, that's complicated, let alone trying to factor in climate change, because that will make lake levels rise or fall, and it's going to make the lake surface itself become more wavy or less wavy, and it's going to give us more rainfall. I think the general predictions are over the course of the year more wet precipitation, so that's going to make more groundwater try to escape the bluffs. So yeah, we'd like to do it. It'd be a very complicated task. I could tell you that. Very difficult, as everything related to climate is, because we're trying to predict the future with a huge monster system that basically covers the whole Earth. It's just very hard to do. But a very good question.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you again, Tony, for presenting today. Make sure you thank Mike for me as well.
Yep.
So that wraps up session 4 of the 4-part Bluff webinar series. I appreciate everybody attending the webinars. I hope you found them useful and productive. And again, we hope to continue hosting some of these virtual workshops or webinars in the future. So do stay tuned. Keep an eye on the Pennsylvania Sea Grant website for updates and your email box. So again, thank you all for attending, and feel free to reach out with us with any questions.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.